making a living 100% Blender based. So I like Blender quite a lot. But yeah, if you want to learn more about my stuff, visit my website. There you find a lot of free tutorials, online courses, and stuff like this. So let's go on. So over the years, I've created different artworks. Just cycle through some of them. And I realized that actually you don't need super complicated workflows to create decent looking artworks. So, and I concentrate here in the talk more on the visual aspect. Like there's also storytelling and composition, all this stuff. But here I want to talk about materials and maybe a little bit about lighting. So all the stuff you see here was mainly created for some competitions. Like I was relatively limited on the time frame. I had a deadline. So I didn't have that much time to create stuff. And usually I start pretty late on these competitions, also when I have like 2 months. I start in the last 2 weeks or 1 week. So things got a little bit tough, especially if you have to model a lot. Then you just have the last day on shading and lighting the whole thing. And that's why I'm mainly using, I call it non-destructive shading. That means that I stay extremely flexible. This one was my last bigger creation, and it was for the ArtStation Challenge. I got an honorable mention for this, which was pretty cool. And here really I shaded this in the last, I don't know, 2 days maybe, just a few hours. And I wanted this to look cool, but I don't want it to use texture painting and spend hours on creating all the fine details. And here I heavily used more or less procedural shading techniques to get this done quickly. So what this means, I will show you during this workshop. So this workshop is more like for beginners, so I will cover like the basics, let's say, and I will take a look from a very artistic point of view. So no super technical stuff here and maybe not super accurate. It's more about getting nice results quickly and without super much effort. So, but before we get into Blender, I will use Blender 2.8. Hopefully this will work out good. We have to understand the foundation here, which is basically masking and mixing. So, what I mainly use are these, you can call them grunge maps, mix masks, whatever you like. But basically, these are just grayscale images. And grayscale you can turn into values on your model on the surface. And basically you can say you have a yes or no or a mix in between. That means if your values on the surface here are black, that means one value or no. And if they are white or brighter, this goes in the yes direction or the other value. You can also use this to mix certain inputs, A and B, and mix them together. So here I have a simple example of the roughness. Here on the left I have 0 roughness. It's a super clean mirroring ball. And here, actually it's not 1, but it's quite high. So let's assume this is 1 value. So we have a very rough surface. And using this mix mask, let's call it this way, we can mix these 2 values together. Like you can see that on areas which are white, we have this very rough surface, and on the areas which are darker, blacker, we have the more clear mirroring ball. Same thing we can apply by mixing different textures together. Like here we have the same mixing mask, and here I mix 2 different textures together. So if I would change, for example, this map over here, this would look completely different in terms of the distribution of the different textures. And you also can mix different shaders. Here on the left we have a glass ball, which is green, and on the right we have a metallic effect, and which I mix together on one surface. So we have one material basically where we can mix all those different things together. And the main thing we are using here are these mixing masks, which can be anything like procedural textures, like bitmaps, texture painting, gradients, whatever you like. So there's really no limit. And it's even easier if you turn those images into repeatable textures, seamless textures. This makes the whole process even easier because you don't have to deal with like seams, stuff like this. So you can download these seamless textures from sites like Texture Haven, which is pretty cool. This is completely free. Then you have paid sites like Polygon or textures.com. And I like to use a very simple program called PixBlend. It's not free, it's paid, but there are also other ways to create seamless textures out of nearly any image texture. So, mixing and masking is pretty smart, and this is what I want to show you here. So, let's get started. Oops. Sorry. So first of all, let's take a look at the basics. Where's the full screen? There. Okay. This is Blender 2.8. Some of you already have tried it, I guess. And we have this nice workspaces up here. And since we want to concentrate on shading right now, we just click on the shading workspace, and everything is ready for us, which is pretty nice. So up here we have the look depth mode. That means there's some kind of HDI map in the background, so we have some basic lighting setup. So we can see our materials, so we don't need to set up anything to view our materials here in the viewport, which is pretty nice and very convenient to use. So let's delete everything here. Let's add, let's say, monkey. Let's subdivide this, and let's smooth this. So, pretty nice here in Blender. We have the principled shader. Let's press new. Let's create a new material. And this shader basically contains everything we need for the majority of materials we can create. And this has a lot of sliders and values, but you don't need that much actually to create some basic materials which look quite good. So, okay. So first things, let's go over this quickly. We have the base color here, which basically controls the color, as you can see. This is the main important value we have. Then if we stay at non-metallic materials, covers nearly everything except metallic materials. We need the roughness value, where we can control how smooth or not smooth the reflection of our model should be. And that's about it for the most important part. Really, these two values, I think, make up 90% of the material, as you will see later on. And we will also use the normal input for adding some bump maps to the surface. So if we stay at the non-metallic materials, if you want to create like a glass material, all you need to do is to turn up the transmission value to 1. We are using Eevee right now here to view it better. Let's enable in the render settings screen space reflection and also the refraction. And over at the material in the options, we also have to enable screen space refraction. Then we have this real-time glass effect. Let's put this one here to be white. And we can see it pretty well with this nice refraction effect. So basically all you need to do is to get a basic glass material to put the transmission slider to 1. So, and now if we want to have a metallic effect, all we need to do is set metallic to 1. So, and this easy we can set the basics or the foundation for metallic materials, glass materials, and like general materials. So, let's get into this by using textures. So there are textures you can use, but this time I won't use Suzanne. I just want to use a basic plane here, because here we have this generated UVs. That means if I tap into edit mode and enable the new UV edit mode down here in the UV image editor, you can see this thing has already a UV map. So because the basic settings I want to show you there, we need a UV map. So I create a new material. It's again this principled shader. And now I want to import some textures. So let's take a look. I've downloaded these texture maps from texturehaven.com, the website I already showed you. And there you have these maps, all this stuff like the diffuse map, displacement, normal map, roughness, all the things you possibly could need. But this time we just want to drag and drop the diffuse color in here, the roughness, and I want to use the bump map. You can also use displacement map or normal map, but I want to keep it simple here. So all I need to do right now is to connect this to the right inputs. So I don't want to have the white color here, so I replace it with this texture. And now we have this nice stone texture here on the ground. And now I'm using this map here. I'm using an add-on called Node Wrangler, which luckily already works in 2.8. So I can hold down Control Shift and left click on a node and see what this thing is doing. So this one here is a grayscale image as shown before. And here I have brighter values and I have darker values. And we can see the roughness is a slider from 0 to 1. And as shown before, 0 equals black or dark, and 1 equals white, and everything in between is like a mixed value of those two. That means if I plug this in here, you can see that the roughness value disappears, and instead of this, he will use this map. So if I connect this, you can now see that we have spots on the area where we have like a more smooth surface, and we have spots where we have a more clear reflection. And as you can see, these two simple textures are already working to make this look like 90% more realistic. So you don't need to add the ambient occlusion map and all this stuff to get like pretty good looking results. I'm not talking about super duper photorealism here, just to get nice looking results quickly. So the next thing here, what I have is the bump map. For this, I need a vector, a bump node, which I can put in between using the height value. And as you can see, height is basically also black and white. That means the darker areas will appear deeper and the white areas will appear like if this is higher. This I put into the normal input. And now we have this very strong bump map. And this is where we have to be careful, because if you crank the bump map way too high, this looks totally unnatural. So you have to use a very, 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 very low value to get a nice looking result. So, and now we have a relatively realistic material just with 3 different maps. So, but sometimes we don't have 3 different maps. We just have one photo, for example. And we quickly want to texture something. And what I do there, I delete this to 1. Let's assume we only have this color map here. It's already seamless, which is nice. But this I want to quickly turn into a roughness map and a bump map. And we can do this by using a converter, a color ramp. So you will see me using the color ramp quite a lot. So let's put this in between. And what this does, we can see the output from this rock texture has a color output, but the input from the color ramp is like gray. This means basically that this is turning the color into grayscale. So let's take a look at this. This is now the input we have. And this is basically a black and white image or a grayscale image we can again use for defining like black areas, like 0 areas and 1 areas, or mixed values in between. That means if I connect this to the roughness right now, I have a similar result. And the nice thing here is I can tweak this, like I can control how much I want to have from both, or I can invert this stuff and just play around with this. And what I even can do is like the dark areas here, this one would be 100% glossy, so no smoothness. But maybe I don't want these super glossy areas on the surface. That means I can click on this handle here and then change the colors, make this just a bit brighter. That means I add a little bit roughness to the darker areas. You can see how this is changing on the surface. So, and the same thing down here, I simply drag in the color map, which then will be converted into grayscale, which defines like uneven surfaces. And yes, I know this is not super accurate, but especially in a case like this here, it's sometimes more than enough to get a nice looking result pretty quickly. So now I have the same thing as before, just with one input texture. So, and for this input texture, you can basically use whatever you like. So, but what if we don't have like a model which is just flat and had a UV map? So let's open up another file. This rock here. Super simple rock, which I created fairly quickly. So if I switch to edit mode, you can see it's actually this model here. I put a subsurf modifier on it. Then I used a displacement modifier with a Voronoi texture to get these larger areas here. Then again, a subsurf modifier to add some more resolution and another displacement with a different procedural noise texture here. So just very quick result. But this is now a 3D. It's generated from modifiers. And I had to do a retopo here and then a UV map, and this would be pretty time consuming, and I don't want to spend this much time on texturing this. So what I can do is I add a new material here. Maybe let's turn down the resolution a bit. And I want to use the same rock material. But if I now plug this in here in the base color, it just gets an average value of this texture, so no texture information on the surface. So what I can do is I use a simple technique which I totally love because it's so simple. I add an input, a texture coordinate node, and in between there I add a vector mapping node. So the texture coordinate node basically defines how the texture should be projected on this model. And here I always use, not always, but in cases like this, I use the object output, which basically projects the texture on the model without stretching or anything like this. Then you can see the mapping node is here for changing location, rotation, and scale of the texture. That means we can play around with this, and this I plug into the vector. Now you can see we can see the texture on the object, but it's stretched here on the sides. And all we need to do to change this is to set the projection mode from flat to box. And now the texture is on all the sides. It's like projected like 6 different projectors projecting the texture on the rock here, like a cube is built around this rock. But you can see still, if I zoom in, on areas where this is overlapping, we have this weird seams popping up. And here we have this nice blend mode, which only works in this box mapping. That means if I increase this, let's use a standard value of 0.2. Now you can see it overblends these areas here. And now I can basically drag and drop this material on any object and will automatically adjust. Or what I can also do is go to edit mode, change the shape of the rock here, for example. Go out and this texture will still work. So I'm not fixed to one object only with a UV map. It's pretty simple. So certainly this does not work with all textures. Like if you have a brick texture with clear patterns in there, this will not work. Certainly on the flat surface, this could work. But on a rock like this, it doesn't work. Like all the things I show you here, see it like something you can use as addition to the things you're already using, or apply it to certain kinds of models. So it's not the one thing you should always use. So now I can easily turn this into a roughness map, as shown before, by simply adding converter color ramp, using as roughness input, and a quick bump map by using the same value. Okay, this one was wrong. This one, actually the color I wanted to use, and definitely turn down the bump map and adjust the color ramp for the roughness here. Let's inverse this. So now I have relatively quickly created this rock here with a texture, just with one image. So now let's get a bit deeper into this. Now I want to add variation. So in the real world, we have like everything is imperfect, more or less everything. So we have like color variations. There's like moss growing on this stuff. And I also want to quickly add these things without spending hours on texture painting this. So what I can do, first of all, I can, for example, change the color of this rock. I can go to color, use saturation in this case. Since the rock already has a color, I can change the hue here by switching the values, make this more greenish, reddish, change this. So, but what if I don't want to have like the reddish color everywhere? I just want to have this in different spaces. So I add a color mix RGB node. Here I can, as you can see, I have two color inputs. I can use two different colors and then somehow mix them together. And for this, I can use the original color as input 1 or 2, and the new generated, let's make this a bit stronger, like so, second color. And if I take a look into this, now it's just an overall blend between those two colors. But here again, I can use texture for mixing this. So in this case, I just use a quick noise texture. A noise texture is generated from Blender through a certain algorithm. That means it's not like an image lying somewhere on your hard drive. So if we take a look at this, it's just this colorful noise. I have some values here to scale it, for example, or to change the details. Like now it's pretty smooth, but if I increase this, you can see there will be added more details. And this colorful image I can also turn into a black and white information, which would look like this. Then again, I can control how strong this should be. I can set this to E so the transition is a bit more smooth. And this I can again use as mixing factor. That means 0 in this case means 100% of input 1, and 1 would mean 100% of input 2. Equal to the colors, black means input 1 and white means input 2. So if I plug this in here, I have a nice mix of those two colors. So and now I can freely play around with this. I can use different scalings. And what I also can do is I delete this texture here, and instead I use another texture. So I add image texture node, click on open, and here I have a bunch of grunge maps. These are just tileable black and white images. So let's use whatever we like. Sorry, it's loading. Let's take this one here, for example. Put this in here. And here I can use the same technique to procedural project this on the rock here by switching this to box mapping. It's a simple blend mode here. And by using the object input. If I like, I can put a mapping node in between to control the size. Maybe let's do this to show you this. But as you can see right now, it's the black and white image projected on this rock, and now I can mix these values again with the brightness values of this texture. So if I can move this around, you can see how this is using this information to mix these two colors. So, but what if I don't want to mix two colors? I want to mix two textures. So that means instead of this color variation in input 2, this one I delete, I use just another texture with the simple box mapping method. And let's simply use this moss texture here, for example, and mix this in. And now you can see that we are mixing these two textures together. And now if you also want the moss here to be included in the very simple roughness map, you can use this output and put it into the color ramp. And the same thing applies to this bump node here. Put it into here. Now let's take a look. Okay, thanks. Exactly, now we have this. And again, we could play around with all the settings here to make this look how we want. So as you can see, we can use different methods to blend different things together in very creative way. Like we can add more and more textures by adding more mix nodes and adding more textures if we like. And there are some other methods which we can use. One thing I want to show you here, for example, is if I use the texture input node or texture coordinate node and use a converter separate RGB and use the normal input. Normal basically means that we have a red, green and a blue channel from different direction projecting on the surface here. And with this separate RGB node, I separate the red, green and blue channel. And then you can see we have this nice like snow effect on the upside here. We can also invert this with a color ramp or a color invert node if we like, if we want to have it from the bottom. But I think from the top is pretty cool right now. And now I have this thing here where I mix these two textures together, and instead of this grunge map over here, I use this information from the blue channel as a mixing mask, basically. Now, as you can see, I'm mixing according to this black and white values, this together. So, and if I put my lovely color ramp in between, can also adjust this if we like, to make this grow a bit more. And maybe this should be a bit more green. Let's add a use saturation node and make this moss a bit more green. So certainly I would play around with the roughness here a bit. But this quick, I created this rock here, and if I like, I can duplicate this, tap into edit mode and change the shape, and everything will adjust automatically. Different rock, but the moss is now growing according to the shape. Pretty nice. And one thing I also want to show you, for example, every rock should now have a different color. So what we can do is I use a mix RGB node and I use a color use saturation node. That means our final output here from the color I plug into the use saturation node, and let's make this a little bit more reddish. Just an example. So then I mix again the original color and the more reddish color. And now I just can mix those things together. I can again use a mixing mask to mix this color, but in this case, I want to use an input object info node and use the random output. That means for every object, it will use a random mix value here. You can really use this random information totally creatively and plug this into different things and randomly mix things together. And now if I'm duplicating this rock, every rock will have a slightly different color, which is pretty cool. Certainly you can say, let's desaturate this a bit, make this maybe a bit darker. So every rock looks different, as you can see. Yeah, and for this kind of thing, this really works. If you do this environment stuff, this makes the whole thing much easier. So now let's get back to this cowboy dude. I have this gun here. Let's quickly take a look at the image. This was the final result. Okay, things don't want to zoom in. You can see it here. And this I want to quickly create now with these techniques I just showed you. So the first thing, which is relatively easy to create, is the wood. For the wood, I created this tileable wood texture, which looks like this. So for this, I use this PixBlend tool to quickly create this seamless texture out of a wood image I found online. And this I will use as texture. So let's create a new material. Basically the same principles we used. Let's drag and drop this wood material into Blender. Connect this with the base color. And then use the input texture coordinate object mapping. And in this case, I put this vector mapping node in between. And set this to box mapping and set the blend mode to 0.2. And now you can see the texture is on this model, but the rotation is not in the way I want to have this. So I can use this mapping node here for the rotation value. I think it was, let's try, yeah, the X value, 90 degrees. And now let's use the same thing again, relatively easy. Converter, color ramp, put it in between. Use this as roughness value. Now let's go in this direction here. Make this relatively rough. And the black value maybe not too strong. So we have this little reflection in here. And again, if we like, this should be relatively smooth, but let's add a bump mat. Put this in here into the height value, normal input, very low value. So, and this now I can drag and drop. Let's call this wood. I just drag and drop this from this field to the objects which should have the wood material, and it will be just work. So it's this simple. So, and certainly what you now can do, for example, let's get to the crunch maps again. Add someone with some higher resolution. Let's, for example, take this one. This is just a black and white image again, or grayscale. Let's use the box mapping again. You can see I'm just doing the same thing over and over again. And let's quickly mix this with a different color. So I use a hue saturation node, a color mix RGB node, and mix a color changed variant and the original using this crunch map for the mixing factor. So that means if I'm now changing the values here, some parts of it will have a different color, so maybe a little bit more yellowish and desaturated, like it's getting old. Put this in here as color. And then we have this variation, which you can easily adjust if you like. So now let's get over to the metal thing. I create a new material, just select one object. New material, let's call this metal. And here again, I have some textures. I have this rust texture. Just drag and drop it here. Let's go to the input texture coordinates, object mapping, box mapping. So since this is all textures which are a little bit more grungy, this works pretty well. Use this as base color, and we have this huge rust effect. Let's put like a vector mapping node in between. And then we have this scaling value. And if I put the scaling value above 1, like if I, for example, use 2, then it will be scaled like we have it smaller on the surface. I can do it for individual axes, as you can see, but here it's useful to scale all the axes at the same time. And what I do here is I want to have a metal, so I turn up the metal to 1. Now this is looking pretty golden here. Maybe this was a golden gun, I don't know. But in this case, I probably would put a hue saturation node in between, maybe turn down the saturation a bit, and maybe use a grunge map again. Let's quickly duplicate this one here with Shift D. Open grunge map. I'm not sure, maybe this one here. Or let's use something with larger spots, which I use with a mix node again, mix RGB. Use this as mixing factor. And now let's mix the original rust color with the more saturated version. So let's see. And we should definitely put a color ramp in between because the contrast is too low. And it's definitely too big. And if this is too big, we have to use a mapping node and scale this up a bit. So we can now mix these two things together, like the rust texture and the more saturated version. So let's use this as color input. This is just an example. You can tweak this for hours if you like. So in this we can also use, for example, as a roughness map. Let's put a color ramp in between. Just quickly use it as roughness information. Because if this is really rusty, then this is probably also pretty rough. And I don't want to have this super strong glossy spots on here. So yeah, you can really tweak this forever, and then you can easily drag and drop it on your objects. And if you applied the scale of all the objects, that the scale is all 1, then the texture will work on all the elements. So, and let's put it up here. You can certainly create color variations of the metal if you like. And I have a little one here. So now I have it textured overall, but now let's add a little bit more interesting stuff. For example, I want to add some scratches here. I have a scratch map, which I drag and drop here. And here I again want to use a box mapping to easily project this everywhere. And let's just mix it into the color of our object. So I want to have this on top of the whole thing, then we have this very white scratches. So let's take a look. We have the scratches here. Can't barely see it, so let's increase the color here. I'm sure, yeah, you can notice this. So you can mix different textures in here. I can use a grunge map again to have the scratches not everywhere if I like, but this will do it for now. And maybe I want to change, for example, the roughness map in a way that the scratches will be a little bit more reflective than the rest. Then let's change stuff a little bit. So you don't always have to use the full color thing you have created to plug this into the roughness map. You can also just use, create from all the stuff you put together, create your own roughness map, for example. So I have the scratches here. You can see this is a black and white map. If I just put this into the roughness value, this would mean everything would be pretty glossy and only the scratches would be rough. If I put like a color ramp in between and invert the whole thing, then you can see, I don't know if you can see it, but they are now really glossy and the rest is super rough, which looks a little bit more realistic. So, and this we can mix now again with our original texture, but in different value. Maybe I just want to have a little bit of the texture, but most of the scratches, for example, and use this as input for our roughness map. And maybe turn down the white value so that everything is not 100% rough. So I think you get the point here. What we also can do, which I really liked, for example, this really works well for metallic materials, is to use the pointiness input. So I go to Input, Geometry. There I have the pointiness output. And let's put a color ramp in between. And what this does actually, if I put these things closer together, did I do anything wrong here? Yeah, certainly this is not working in Eevee. So we have to use cycles for this, to show this. So most of the thing works as well in Eevee as in cycles, but this one thing does only work in cycles, so we probably have to bake this later on if we want to use this in Eevee as well. So what this is doing, it basically detects the sharp edges of our model. This certainly only works well if you have a high resolution model here. So the lower the resolution, the not so nice look this. So if I put this over here, you can see we have this nice edges detect. And now I can add this like Run effect, that the edges have a little bit scratches and so on. So let's maybe put a mask node behind this with the add value. And we can increase the strings. And we have to adjust this as well. Sorry, let's change this to multiply. So with this value, I just increase the strength of this effect, basically. So if I increase this value down here, this will be stronger. So it has a stronger effect. And this we can now mix into, in this case, it makes most sense to mix it into our roughness map, because we want to have, for example, more glossiness on these edges. So I put another mix node behind this, use this as a mix factor, for example. So as you can see, this is now white. This probably should be black. That means let's turn this color over to black. And black for the roughness value means a lot of glossiness. So if I put this in here, let's take a look at this for now. This is too dark. Let's put this up just to see the difference. Okay, can't really see it. Put it in another way. Let's put this out here. Just to show you the effect. You can now see we have this more glossy edges. And again, if we now would, for example, put in a roughness map, like this one down here. Let's switch this to a roughness value. Texture, grunge maps. Let's use something here. We can now use a texture coordinate input again with the object mapping. Sorry that things get a bit messy here. And mix this into this here, for example, so that we don't have this very smooth line. Instead, we have more like fine details over here. So can mix this as mixing factor, put this in here. And now you can see we have this more details in here. Maybe let's put a converter in here. And change this. Now you can see we have these details in here, which we then again can use as a roughness map. So and if we combine this, for example, for the bump map, let's use a vector bump node. Use this as height information. Take a look at this. And let's decrease the strength here. And probably you have to invert this. Sorry. Yeah. then we can have this bump effect over here at the edges as well. So, but as you can see, you can be really creative with this and just mix all these things together to get like a really quick effect of this materials and so on. So this looks more complicated as it is because it uses the same things over and over again. But yeah, if you know the basic principles of using a mixing mask and mix different values together, you can be really creative. So let's open another file here, the cigar from this guy here. And the cigar, you always have to keep in mind that, for example, in this case, I wanted to create an image, and the cigar is relatively small. So I don't want it to spend like a lot of time texturing the cigar. And I really quickly put this together so that from afar this looks just more than okay. So this is the final result here. Actually the model is super simple. It's like cylinder just scaled a bit in the center, and up front here these are just these weird shapes which I put together. So I have this like paper look. And then down here, now we are using Eevee again. For the main texture here, I used a very quick paper texture. It's this here, nothing fancy, which I colored in just 2 different brown tones. From close, this looks not so nice, but from far away, this was more than enough to have this like paper look for the cigar. Then I used a simple noise texture generated from Blender to create this tiny little noise here, to add with another mix node a different brown color, just to add some variations in color over here. And then up here I used a gradient texture. This is just a gradient, and with the mapping node you can rotate this in the way you want, and with the X value you can move it around if you like. And this I mixed with another noise texture, as you can see, this one here. And then I had this result. So I'm mixing a noise texture with a gradient here. And for example, I can control the noise here, and with the X value I can control the gradient. And with this one I had this 4 minutes left. Oh, damn, I thought I have half an hour left. Sorry. But yeah, this is also fine as final thing here. Let's quickly look into this. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to add this ash effect in the front here, this burned out effect, and this glowing parts. So, and all I just used was this gradient texture mixed with different noise textures. So at the end, this was the one gradient, this was the other, which I then mixed together. And I had this result, and I can easily burn this with the gradient, with the mapping node. And what I did here, I added an emission node and a mix shader, since we can also mix 2 different shaders together. That means as a mixing factor, again, I used like a mixing mask over here, which is basically just this gradient again. So, and if we have this nice bloom effect in Eevee enabled, see the result. Yeah, it looks like this. Maybe the glossiness is too strong that we can adjust, but now let's easily burn this or let's increase like the burn effect or the glowing effect. So you get an idea how simply you can really create stuff like this. And let's shortly get back to this here. This stuff, the first models here, these are pure sculptings. That means they have an extremely high resolution, because I created them for Sculpt January, a sculpting event every January where you have to create like 31 sculptings in 31 days. And in this particular Sculpt January, I wanted also to shade my models, but certainly I don't want to create a retopology for every model, and I quickly wanted to create this shader for these creatures. So for example here, It's everything procedural, no external textures used. Only here I used some vertex painting. That means I colored the vertices in black and white, which again I used as a mixing mask to add this color to the nose here or to the ears. But the rest is purely created in Blender. Same thing over here. If you take a closer look, it's basically just a mixture of different noise textures with bigger and smaller patterns. And the pointiness node to get this shadow in all these creases. And it's really enough to get the impression that we have these textures. And this model, created in a few hours, even got into the 3D Artist magazine with no special textures used here. Same here, the only thing I used here was seamless skin texture for the skin, which I use the same box mapping effects, same on the beard and so on, but the rest is purely procedural generated. Same over here, the scales, they are not perfect at all, but it served the fact that I quickly wanted to shade this. It's purely a Voronoi, a generated Voronoi texture thrown onto the models with some roughness information and some vertex painting for the mouse where I used a different material basically. Yeah, and the list goes on and on. This is basically how I create my models. Yeah, time is over. Sorry, I didn't get that. Thanks a lot.